She was on her knees in the snow, not because she had done something wrong, but because she had done something too right. She had saved his son's life, and for that, he banished her, pointed his finger at her like she was nothing, like she was filth that had dared to breathe the same frozen air as royalty. The entire pack watched in silence as she was dragged to the border. No trial, no mercy, no truth, just the cold, and his burning red eyes full of contempt. But here is what the Alpha didn't know, what no one in that pack dared to whisper. The mark hidden beneath her collar, the ancient glow pulsing from the necklace she never removed, the wolves that howled only when she walked past. She was not a maid. She was never just a maid, and the moon herself had been waiting, patiently waiting, for the moment this broken, banished woman would finally remember who she was. Stay with me, because what happens next will change everything. Chapter 1. The fortress had no warmth, not in its stones, not in its corridors, not in the eyes of the wolves who stalked them. Black Fang Keep rose from the northern territories like a wound in the earth, all iron gates and crooked towers, its walls thick enough to swallow screams whole. Snow came early here and stayed long past welcome. The wind had a personality, cruel, and the pack that called this fortress home had long ago learned to match it. They were feared across 4 territories. Rightly so. Seraphine knew better than to forget that. She was awake before the sun. She was always awake before the sun, sweeping ash from hearths still warm from the night before, hauling water up the east corridor before the higher-ranking wolves stirred and demanded it, moving through the keep like a shadow that had learned to apologize for its own shape. Her hands were rough. Her uniform was gray. Her eyes, when she allowed them to lift, were the quiet color of storm water. She did not allow them to lift often. This was intentional. The Black Fang hierarchy was not a ladder, it was a cliff face. At the top, Alpha Kalem, whose power was the kind that altered the air in a room before he entered it. Beneath him, his lieutenants. Beneath them, the warriors, the trackers, the blessed. And far, far below in the place where the light didn't bother reaching the servants. Seraphine was among the lowest of them. She had been here 2 years. In that time, she had made herself forgettable in the way that only the truly careful can manage. She ate in corners. She spoke in monosyllables. She faded from memories like breath from cold glass. The other maids knew her name and little else. The warriors looked through her. The lieutenants did not look at all. Good, she told herself, each time. Good. She swept the great hall in the early hours, listening to the sound of her own broom against stone, to the distant howl of wind at the ramparts. She had learned, in her time here, to measure safety in silence. The keep was safe when it was quiet. The keep was dangerous when it was not. This morning was quiet. She was finishing the eastern staircase when she heard it soft, broken, the particular texture of a sound that comes from a child fighting sleep and losing. The heir's chambers were at the top of those stairs. Seraphine set her broom against the wall. Aaron was 6 years old, and carried grief in his body, the way old wolves carry old wounds deep in the bone, surfacing in the cold. His mother had died before he was old enough to hold her face in his memory. What remained was absence, a shape in the air beside his father, a name spoken carefully, an ache he could not name because no one had given him the words for it. She pushed the door open softly. He was sitting up in bed, small and rigid, his dark hair damp at the temples, his eyes fixed on something that was not in the room. Night terror. He had them often. Seraphine. He said her name the way drowning people say shore. I'm here. She crossed the room and sat at the edge of his bed without asking permission, which was the thing about children they had not yet learned to weaponize permission. She reached for the book on his nightstand. It was battered, spine-cracked, read so many times the pages had gone soft. Where did we leave off? The Wolf Queen was at the river. His voice was steadying already. She could hear it. Right. She opened to the page. The Wolf Queen was at the river. She read until his breathing slowed. She read until the stiffness left his small shoulders and he slid, degrees by degrees, back into sleep. She read until she was certain, and then she sat another moment in the silence, watching the way the candlelight moved across his face. He looked, sometimes, like his father. That was a complicated thing to notice. She rose carefully, set the book down, and that was when the candlelight caught it, the necklace, swinging free from her collar where the fabric had shifted. She caught it quickly, pressed it flat against her sternum, tucked it back beneath the gray. Her jaw was tight for a moment. Then it wasn't. No one had seen. No one was ever looking. She slipped out of the heir's chambers and retrieved her broom from where she'd left it. The eastern corridor was still empty. The fortress breathed around her in its iron way. Somewhere above, the Alpha would already be awake. She knew his schedule, the way she knew the layout of every room, the creak of every board, the angle of every shadow. She knew because knowing kept her safe. She swept. She was invisible. Here. A ghost in a gray uniform. A woman with no past worth mentioning and no future worth wanting. She was invisible. And invisibility, she knew, was its own kind of armor. She swept, and the keep did not notice her, and she allowed herself, for one unguarded moment at the end of the hall where no one could see, to close her eyes. Beneath her collar, against her heart, the necklace was warm. It was always warm. Chapter 2. The cold that morning had teeth. It came off the training yard in waves, biting through wool and skin and scents, and the young wolves sparring in it wore the pain like a badge, because that was what Black Fang taught before it taught anything else. That discomfort was the beginning of strength. That suffering, endured without complaint, was its own kind of honor. Aaron had no business being in the yard. He was 6, and small for it, and the healers had said only last week that his lungs were still tender from the autumn sickness. But he had his father's stubbornness threaded through him like iron wire, and when the older pups trained, he watched from the fence with an expression so naked in its wanting that someone, Seraphine, never learned who had let him join. She saw it happen from the upper courtyard, where she was beating ice from a hanging rug. One moment he was there, small and determined in the snow, his breath coming in white puffs, his fists raised the way she'd seen him practice alone in his chambers against imaginary enemies. The next moment he wasn't. He went down hard, not the stumble of a tired child, not the fall of one who lost his footing. This was different. This was a body abandoning itself. He hit the snow, and his back arched, and the sound that came out of him was wrong in a way that traveled the length of Seraphine's spine before her mind had finished registering it. The yard went still. The healers, 2 of them, senior wolves with decades of experience between them, moved to him and then stopped. She watched them stop. She watched them look at each other with the particular expression of people who recognize something beyond the edge of their training. Aaron's small body convulsed again. His skin, even from this distance, had gone the color of old bone. The ancient fever. She had read about it, once, in a book she was not supposed to have accessed. It struck only bloodlines old enough to have magic in the marrow wolves whose ancestry predated the pack structure itself. It moved fast. It moved like fire in dry wood. The healers were still looking at each other. Seraphine dropped the rug. She did not think about rank. She did not think about permission, or consequence, or the red eyes of the Alpha who was not yet present in the yard but would be. She thought about the boy who said her name like it meant shore. She thought about the book on his nightstand, and the sound of his breathing evening out, and she ran. The crowd parted for her not out of respect, but out of shock. A maid, running. A low-born woman shouldering through wolves 3 times her size, dropping to her knees in the snow beside the heir of Black Fang without a single moment of hesitation. She pressed both hands to his chest. What happened next, she would not explain. Not then, not later, not to anyone who asked. She closed her eyes and the necklace beneath her collar went from warm to burning, and something moved through her, not power, exactly, more like memory, more like recognition. She pressed it into the boy, this thing without a name, and the fever pushed back, and she held. The convulsing stopped. By degrees, the way a storm decides it is finished, the arching of his back released. His color shifted, still pale, still frightening, but no longer the color of something that had already left. His chest rose, fell, rose again. A breath, a real one. The yard was completely silent. Aaron opened his eyes and looked up at her, and in them she saw the confusion of someone returning from somewhere very far away, and she pulled her hands back and folded them in her lap, and looked at him steadily, and said, very quietly, "You're all right." He believed her. He always believed her. The silence lasted 3 more seconds. Then she felt it, that alteration in the air, the pressure drop that preceded him the way thunder follows lightning. She did not need to turn around. She knew. Alpha Calum had arrived. She heard his footsteps cross the yard. She heard the crowd arrange itself differently in his presence. The subtle shift of bodies, the straightening of spines. She felt the moment his gaze found her, still kneeling in the snow beside his son, her hands folded, her head beginning to rise. His eyes, when they met hers, were red. Not the red of anger, exactly. The red of something colder. Something that had learned, over years of loss and power and grief, to look at the world through the lens of threat. He did not look at a woman who had just saved his son. She understood that immediately. She saw what he saw instead, a low-born maid of unknown origin, crouched over the heir of Blackfang, having performed something that no one could name or explain, without permission, without rank, without the right. He looked at her the way wolves look at things they cannot afford to trust. His voice, when it came, did not raise itself. It did not need to. It cut through the snow and the silence with the precision of something that had never needed volume to be obeyed. Banish her. A pause, surgical. Tonight, and if she crosses our borders again, she answers to me. No one moved to contradict him. No one looked at Seraphine as though she deserved defending. She rose from the snow slowly, with a steadiness that cost her more than she allowed her face to show. She did not look at Aaron, because she could not afford to. She did not beg. She had never begged. She would not begin now. Not here. Not in front of the man whose mercy was the shape of exile. She did not cry. She only reached up, beneath the collar of her gray uniform, and closed her fingers around the necklace. It was still warm. She held it, and breathed, and let the Alpha's word become her sentence, and said nothing at all. Chapter 3. The border was a feeling before it was a place. She crossed it at dusk, when the light was dying in shades of bruised amber, and the tree line swallowed her whole. No ceremony, no escort. 2 guards had walked her to the edge of Blackfang territory and stopped, as though the air beyond it was something they had agreed not to breathe. She had kept walking. She had not looked back. That had been 3 days ago. Survival, she had learned long before Blackfang, was mostly about refusing to stop. She found shelter in the hollow shoulder of a fallen oak, wide enough to curl inside, deep enough to keep the wind off. She built fire the way she'd been taught, not with the tools she didn't have, but with patience, with the particular stubbornness of someone who has decided that cold is not a reason. The forest offered what it offered. Bark she recognized as edible, ice she could melt, roots she knew by shape. She ate without tasting. She slept in shifts. The wilderness was brutal in the indifferent way that only wild things manage, not malicious, simply unconcerned. It did not care whether she lived or not. That was almost a comfort. The things that had not cared at Blackfang had at least pretended otherwise. On the second night, she became aware that she was not alone. She saw them first as a displacement of shadow between the trees, something large, moving with the liquid silence of creatures who had never needed to learn stealth because they had been born to it. She added wood to the fire and sat very still and waited. They emerged in pieces, a muzzle, a shoulder, the pale coin gleam of an eye. Wolves, silver-coated, all of them, enormous in the way that ancient things become enormous, not just size, but weight, the accumulated gravity of years she couldn't calculate. 3, then 4, then a 5th, at the tree line, who did not fully emerge, only watched. They did not attack. They arranged themselves at the perimeter of the firelight and regarded her, and she regarded them, and the silence was the particular quality of a conversation being conducted in a frequency she couldn't quite hear. "I don't have food to offer," she said, eventually. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears. She had not spoken in days. "I barely have food for myself." The nearest wolf, largest of them, a scar running the full length of its left flank, tilted its great head, listening. She talked to them after that, not because she believed they understood her, or perhaps precisely because she suspected they did. She talked because the alternative was silence, and silence, out here, had started to acquire a texture she didn't trust. She talked until the fire burned low, and then she slept. The dreams came without warning, as they always did. Fire, first always fire. the orange-red violence of a building that had once been someone's entire world, now becoming no one's. She was inside it, and then she wasn't, and a woman was screaming her name with the specific pitch of a voice that has run out of anything except the name of the thing it is losing. Seraphine. The syllables distorted by smoke and distance and grief. Then moonlight, a clearing, a circle of figures in white, and in the center, something being consecrated, or promised, or sealed. A ceremony of the kind that required witnesses. She was there. She understood that. She was part of what was being bound. And then the violence arrived without warning, as violence does when it has been patient long enough, and the circle scattered, and the moonlight was wrong, and someone pressed something into her hands and said. She woke gasping. Her hands were at her collar before her eyes had adjusted. She held the necklace against her sternum, its warmth immediate, steadying, the way a known voice steadies in the dark. She pressed it there and breathed, and listened to the forest, and waited for her heartbeat to return to something she recognized. The silver wolves were still at the tree line, watching. "I know," she said to them, though she didn't. Not yet, not fully. She lay back and watched the sky pale toward morning, and held the necklace, and thought about the woman's voice in the dream, which was the thing she could never quite hold on to when she woke the voice, and the face that went with it, and the specific word she'd been given at the end. It unraveled every time, like smoke. Inside the fortress that had exiled her, the air of Blackfang was not eating. It had begun the morning after. The tray returned untouched. Then again. The kitchen staff reported it in the cautious way of people who understand that the alpha's grief, when it surfaces, is not always a safe thing to be near. A healer was sent. The boy was physically well, or well enough. He sat in his window and looked at the snow and said, plainly, with the bluntness of a child who has not yet learned to soften difficult truths, "I want the reading, lady." Caleb dismissed it. Children clung to things. Children let go. It was the nature of children, and grief, and time. Mother Voss said nothing. She did not specialize in contradiction. She specialized in watching. The old healer had been with the Black Fang pack for longer than most of its members had been alive. She had seen the fever before, twice, in her decades of practice. She knew its mark. She knew the particular way it scarred the ones it released, if they were lucky enough to be released. She bent over the boy's sleeping form in the afternoon light and examined the mark on his sternum where the fever had burned its passing a branching silver trace, the width of 2 fingers, the shape of something she had not seen outside of very old texts. A Luna mark, precisely as the text described. Her expression did not change. She straightened. She walked, at the unhurried pace she had cultivated over decades of not wanting to appear alarmed, to her private chambers at the back of the healer's wing. She closed the door. She pulled from the lowest shelf a record book so old its cover had gone soft, and she sat, and she opened it. She began to search. Outside, the snow kept falling. The boy kept not eating. And somewhere beyond the border, in the hollow shoulder of a fallen oak, a woman with rough hands and a warm necklace pressed closed her eyes and tried, again, to remember the word she was given at the end of the dream. Chapter 4. The storm arrived the way catastrophe always does, gradually, then all at once. She had felt it building since midday, the sky lowering itself in increments, the silver wolves withdrawing into the tree line earlier than usual, the forest going quiet in the particular way that meant every creature with instinct enough to listen had already made a decision. She had packed what little she had and moved. The chapel found her, or she found it, she was never entirely sure, afterward, which was true. It emerged from the snowfall like a memory surfacing. Old stone walls, a collapsed roof at one end, the other end, holding stubbornly against the weather in the way of things built by people who had believed they were building for eternity. No doors left on the hinges, no glass in the windows, but walls. Walls were enough. She got the fire going in the corner where the wind couldn't reach, and pulled her coat tight, and listened to the storm dismantle the world outside. Lightning moved through the clouds in slow pulses, not close yet, but coming. She did not notice the carvings at first. The chapel was dark and she was tired, and her attention was on the fire, on the snow coming through the broken roof, on the small logistics of surviving the night. It was only when the lightning came closer when it began to flash in true earnest, throwing white light through every gap in the stone that she saw them. The walls were covered, floor to ceiling, every surface, carved with an intricacy that should not have survived this long and yet had figures and symbols intertwined. A narrative pressed into stone by hands that had known exactly what they were recording and had wanted it to last. She rose slowly, raised the small torch she'd made from a branch and held it close. A ceremony. That was the first thing she understood. Figures arranged in a circle, robed, their faces upturned toward something above them. A symbol she half recognized in the way you half recognize something from a dream. At the center of the circle, a woman, her arms raised, something being placed upon her head. A coronation. Then, in the next sequence of carvings, violence, the circle breaking, figures fleeing. The woman at the center, the crowned woman pressing something small against her chest, a necklace, a pendant, something that the carver had rendered with unusual care and unusual detail. Seraphine's torch hand was no longer entirely steady. The next panel, a child, small, swaddled, being carried by a single figure moving away from the chaos, away from the burning that the carver had depicted in jagged upward lines that were also clearly meant to be flame. The child being hidden, the figure moving into wilderness, into exile, into the deliberate obscurity of someone who understands that disappearance is the only protection left. The final panel, a symbol, pressed into the child's skin, or perhaps the child's soul. The carver had not made the distinction clear like a seal on a letter. Like a door being locked from the outside. A bloodline, disguised, a name, buried. A luna air, made invisible. She was still staring at the wall when the lightning struck closest, a crack of it that lit the entire chapel white for 2 full seconds. Every carving thrown into sharp and terrible relief, and her necklace caught it, or answered it. She felt it before she saw it. Warmth becoming heat, becoming something that moved through her sternum and radiated outward. And she looked down, and the pendant was glowing, not the orange red of fire, not the yellow of candlelight. This was silver white and cold, and completely steady moonlight, made dense, made solid, made real. It lit the chapel. It lit the carvings. It lit her face and her hands, and she stood in the middle of it and felt something shift deep beneath her ribs. Not pain, not power, something older than either of those words. Something that had been pressed very small for a very long time, locked away in the place where the door had been sealed, beginning, only the first breath of it to move. Like a door, remembering it had a hinge. She did not understand it. She was not ready to understand it. She stood in the light of her own necklace and looked at the wall that had been waiting in this ruined chapel for 20 years or 20 centuries, and felt her hands shake, and did not stop them. Because there was no one here to see, and because sometimes the body knows things the mind needs more time to accept. The glow faded slowly as the lightning moved away. The chapel went dark again. She sat down in the corner, wrapped her arms around her knees, and stared at the carvings until the fire burned low. The records room at Blackfang was silent at this hour. Mother Voss had been here since before supper. The candle beside her had burned to 1/3 of its original height. She had not noticed. She had been reading, and then she had stopped reading, and for the last several minutes, she had been sitting with the book open in her lap, and her hands folded on top of the page, and her eyes fixed on nothing at all. The record was dated 20 years ago, in the careful script of a pack historian who had understood the significance of what they were recording and had been afraid of it, afraid enough to seal it, afraid enough to file it where no one looked. The night the Alpha King fell, the court in chaos, the Luna declared dead in the violence of the overthrow. No body recovered. A detail logged quietly, without emphasis, in a subordinate clause, as though it were a loose thread and not, in fact, the thread that unraveled everything. Mother Voss closed the book. Her hands, when she set it on the table, were not entirely steady. She sat in the silence for a long moment, listening to the distant howl of the storm at the ramparts. Then she reached for a second candle, lit it from the first, and drew toward her a blank sheet of paper. She did not write anything yet. She only held the pen and thought, and outside the snow kept falling on the territory that had just, without knowing it, exiled the wrong woman. Chapter 5. Mother Voss had survived 6 alphas. This was not a boast she never boasted. It was simply the arithmetic of a long life lived in proximity to power. She had learned, across those decades, that the most dangerous questions were the ones that arrived dressed as something else entirely. A concern, a pleasantry, a casual observation delivered on the way out the door, when the person being asked had already begun to relax. She visited Caleb's study on a Tuesday, when his schedule made him available, and his mood, she had calculated, was likely to be merely cold rather than actively hostile. "The heir's appetite has improved," she said, settling herself in the chair across from his desk with the unhurried ease of a woman who had earned the right to sit unbidden. "The fever left no lasting damage that I can find. His lungs are clear." Caleb did not look up from the document he was reviewing. "Good. I want to ensure we understand what happened. For the records." "Fever of that type." She paused, selecting the next words the way a hunter selects footing on uncertain ground. "Requires documentation. For future reference." Now he looked up. "What requires documentation?" Voss continued, her tone the same temperature throughout. "Is the intervention. The maid who acted." She tilted her head slightly. "How long did she serve here?" "I find I never took note of it." The irritation moved across his face like weather. 2 years, perhaps slightly more. "And before that, who vouched for her placement?" A pause. "The kind that means the answer is not immediately available." "The household steward at the time. He died last winter." Voss nodded as though this were a satisfying answer rather than a sealed door. "And her origin? Her bloodline?" "She was a maid, Voss." His voice had acquired the particular flatness that served as his warning. "She swept floors. I did not require a genealogy." "Of course." She rose, unhurried, smoothing her robes. "I ask only for the records. You understand an unknown individual performing an unknown healing on the Alpha's heir. It wants documentation." She offered him a small, professional smile. "For future reference." She was at the door when she paused, as she had intended to pause, as she had planned from the moment she'd sat down. "The mark the fever left," she said. "Has it faded?" Something shifted in his expression too fast to name. "I haven't examined it." "You should," she said. "When you have a moment." She left him with that, which was precisely what she had come to do. The enforcers arrived at his study an hour later, which was not part of her plan, but suited it regardless. There were 2 of them, Ran and Dessa, his most reliable border wolves, not given to exaggeration or invention. They stood in the way of people delivering news they expect to be dismissed, and have decided to deliver plainly anyway. The silver wolves had been sighted again. Not at the wilderness perimeter. Not in the neutral territory beyond the border. Moving inward. Moving, with the deliberate and unhurried certainty of things that had made a decision, toward Blackfang land. "Wild pack migration," Caleb said. "The storm will have shifted their route." Ran and Dessa exchanged the look of people who had anticipated this response and not been comforted by anticipating it. They said what they'd come to say, and they were dismissed, and they went. Caleb stood at his window and watched the snow. The trouble with certainty, he had found, was that it required maintenance. He was certain the light had been the fever. He had been certain of this from the moment he'd arrived in the training yard and seen it, that brief, cold luminescence moving from her hands into his son's chest, silver white and impossible. He had filed it immediately under fever illusion, under the distortions that extreme magical illness was known to produce in witnesses. He had been very firm about this, in the privacy of his own mind, but the mind, at night, was less amenable to firmness. He stood at the window and the snow came down, and he thought about her hands. Not her face, he would not think about her face, just her hands, pressed flat against his son's sternum, and the total absence of hesitation. No rank would have moved that fast. No one with something to protect would have run toward an unknown magical event without a moment of self-preservation. She had simply run. He told himself, again, that it had been the fever's illusion. He turned from the window and did not sleep well, which was not, he told himself, related. In the wilderness, it came without warning. She was at the stream, breaking ice at the edge to reach the water beneath, when her hands stopped obeying her. The necklace flared warm against her skin, and she straightened and her body did something she had been suppressing. with great effort and great cost, for longer than she could account for. It began in her spine. A fracturing sensation, not pain exactly, or not only pain like something sealed cracking open along old seam lines. She made it to the bank before her knees gave way. She pressed both hands into the snow, and the shift took her in fragments, uncontrolled in a way that told her how long she had been holding it back, because it arrived the way things do when they have been held too long. All at once, and with an authority that made her own will briefly irrelevant. The wolf that emerged was not what she had expected. She had not let herself expect. But if she had, this was not it. The silver wolves at the tree line went very still. The largest one, the one with the scar along its flank, lowered its great head. Not in threat, in recognition. She stood in the snow in a form she had not worn in years, and her chest heaved, and the necklace lay against her fur. Still warm, still glowing its faint and patient silver, and she understood not everything. Not yet, but something. Something that the chapel had started and the shift had continued, like a sentence finally reaching its verb. The scarred wolf held her gaze, and waited. Chapter 6. She almost missed the door. It was the wolf that found it, or found the absence of it, which was the same thing. She had returned to human form by morning, shaking and hollowed out in the particular way of a first shift after long suppression, and she had gone back to the chapel, because it was shelter, and because something in her was not finished with it yet. She was moving along the back wall, her torch held close to the carvings she had not yet examined, when her foot found a depression in the stone floor that the snow had concealed. She cleared it with her hands. A seam. A precise rectangle cut into the chapel floor, the edges too clean for anything but intention. A handle of iron, corroded but intact. She pulled. The vault beneath had been sealed for a long time. She could feel it in the quality of the air that rose to meet her. The held-breath stillness of a room that had been waiting in the dark and had not dared to hope. She took the stairs one at a time, the torch held ahead of her, and descended. The chamber was small. Everything in it had been placed with care. That was the first thing she understood, not abandoned, not fled from. Placed. Each object set in deliberate relation to the others, arranged by someone who had understood they would not be returning, and had wanted the arrangement to matter. A cradle, at the center. Stone, not wood built to last. Empty, its interior lined with fabric so old it had gone to the texture of paper, but the color still faintly visible. Deep blue, the blue of sky at the precise moment before it becomes night. Beside it, folded with the same deliberate care, a cloak. She lifted it, and the fabric held extraordinary, that some combination of material and preservation she could not account for. The lining was plain. The outside carried a sigil, embroidered in silver thread, the silver gone slightly dark with age, but the shape intact, unmistakable even to someone who had spent years not allowing themselves to recognize things. The Lunara bloodline. She had read about it, in books she was not supposed to access. The sacred line. The Lunas chosen not through the bond, not through mating or proximity to alpha power, but by something older than all of that. A celestial inheritance, passed through blood, through generations, surfacing when it surfaced, and incapable of being manufactured or transferred or forced. The line that the overthrow, 20 years ago, had supposedly ended. She was still holding the cloak when she turned to the wall. They had saved the wall for last, whoever had prepared this chamber. The carvings here were different from those above. Not a narrative sequence, not a history lesson. These were intimate. A single image at the center, surrounded by moon-script text, and she had to hold the torch very close to read it, because the letters were small, carved by a hand she somehow recognized in its quality of line, in its particular way of pressing harder at the beginning of each stroke. The image was a woman holding a child. The text was a name. Not the name she had been given in service, not the careful, forgettable syllables she had assembled for herself like a costume, designed to attract no attention in a place where attention was dangerous. A different name, a full name, the kind that carried weight and lineage and the specific gravity of something that had been sealed away and hidden, and kept alive through 20 years of careful silence. Her name? She knew it the way you know a sound you haven't heard since childhood, not with the mind first, but with the body. Her sternum recognized it before her eyes had finished reading it. The necklace blazed white against her skin. and then she was on the stone floor, and she was not certain when that had happened, and she was weeping in a way she had not permitted herself in 2 years of silence and suppression, and careful invisibility. Not the weeping of grief exactly, or not only that. The weeping of a person who has been holding a shape for so long that releasing it is its own kind of violence. She heard her mother's voice. Clear. For the first time since the dreams had started clear and close and specific. The way a sound becomes when you finally understand what word it was saying. Seraphine. Not a maid's name. Not a nobody's name. A name written in moon script in a sealed vault in the ruins of a chapel in the middle of a wilderness that the silver wolves had been circling for weeks. A name that meant something. She held the cloak against her chest and wept until she was empty. And then she sat in the emptiness and breathed, and began slowly, incompletely, in the hesitant way of someone who has been in the dark long enough that light requires adjustment to remember. Mother Voss worked quickly, which was not her natural mode, but was, she had decided, the appropriate one. The rubbing had taken her 3 attempts. The mark on Aron's chest was small, and the light in his chambers was poor, and she could not ask for assistance without explanation, which she could not give. She had managed it on the 3rd try, transferring the precise shape of it onto thin paper with the side of a charcoal stick. The branching silver lines rendered faithfully, the central sigil unmistakable to anyone who had read far enough in the right texts. She sealed the letter herself. She addressed it to a name she had not written in over a decade, a name that belonged to a woman who sat on the High Moon Council and who had, if Voss remembered correctly, been present 20 years ago when the world cracked open. She was at the door of the records room, the sealed letter in her hands, when the door opened from the other side. Calum filled the frame. He looked at the letter, at her, at the council seal on the address, which she had not had time to conceal. His expression moved through several things in quick succession before it settled into the cold and dangerous stillness that meant he was controlling something larger than what was visible. What is that? Not a question, an excavation. Voss looked at him without flinching. She had survived 6 alphas, and this was not the most frightening thing she had done in the service of any of them. And she had decided on the walk from her desk to this door that she was too old to begin being afraid of necessary things. A letter to the High Moon Council, she said, with evidence. About a mistake. She held his gaze. About a woman you put outside your borders in the snow, who may be who I believe is rather more significant than either of you knew. She let that settle for exactly a beat. I am correcting it, before it destroys us all. The silence between them had the quality of held breath. She did not move. Neither did he. The letter stayed in her hands, and she waited, and outside the window the snow had stopped falling. And somewhere above them, somewhere the Blackfang Fortress could not see, and had not thought to look, the moon was full, and very bright, and entirely patient. Chapter 7. The council's response arrived before dawn. This was itself a message. The High Moon Council did not move quickly. It was one of the organizing principles of their authority. The deliberate weight of their pace. The way they communicated through their very slowness that no matter was urgent enough to disturb their dignity. Calum had sent urgent missives to the council twice in his tenure as Alpha, on matters he had considered genuinely critical, and had waited 6 weeks for the first response and 9 for the second. The response to Voss's letter arrived in 11 hours. He read it standing. He did not sit because sitting felt like a concession to something he was not prepared to concede. The language was formal and even, and beneath its formality was an edge that he recognized, the edge of an institution that had been waiting for something and had just been told where to look. An envoy will be dispatched immediately. The woman will not be harmed, moved, or interfered with prior to their arrival. This is not a request. He set the letter down. He looked at Voss, who was standing by the window with the expression of someone who has done a difficult thing and arrived at the far side of it. You had no authority, he said. No, she agreed. I had evidence. The authority belongs to them. A pause. It always did. He left her there. He went to his rooms and stood at the window for a long time, watching the sky lighten from black to the dark gray of a winter morning that had not decided yet what kind of day it intended to be. He thought about the letter's instruction will not be interfered with, and he thought about Aron's mark, which he had finally examined last night, alone, holding the candle close to his sleeping son's sternum and looking at what was carved there in silver and deciding that he did not yet know what it meant. He told himself he was riding out to bring her in for questioning. He told himself this with the conviction of a man who has learned, over years of authority, to believe his own stated reasons at least long enough to act on them. He was Alpha. She was a woman of uncertain origin who had been within his borders under unknown pretense and had performed an unknown working on his heir. Questioning was appropriate. Questioning was, in fact, his responsibility. He told himself this while he saddled his horse. He told himself this while Ran and Dessa fell in beside him, silent and professional and carefully not asking the questions their faces were assembling. He told himself this for the first 2 hours of riding, while the snow came up to the horse's knees, and the tree line closed in, and the tracks left by something with enormous paws, multiple sets, moving in loose formation, appeared, and then multiplied, and then began to resolve into a direction that led, with increasing clarity, toward the ruins he had been told about by border scouts who had spoken about them in the careful tones people use for places they do not want to explain. The tracks stopped at the chapel. He left the horses with Dessa. He went in on foot, because something in his body had made this decision before his mind caught up with it, and he told himself this was tactical. The entrance was narrow, the interior unknown, and he moved through the broken doorway and saw the stairs and descended. The light reached him before anything else did. Silver white, steady, emanating from below in a way that cast the stairwell in sharp and sourceless clarity. Not firelight, not torchlight. Something with a different quality entirely, the kind of light that does not flicker because it is not burning, because it has no fuel, because it simply is. He descended the last 3 steps and stopped. The chamber was not large, but it felt enormous, perhaps because of what it contained. The cradle. The ancient sigil on the cloak that it took him 3 seconds to identify, and then another 2 seconds to accept that he had identified correctly. The moon script moving across the walls and floor in slow, luminous patterns, as though it were breathing, and at the center of it, Seraphine. She was standing with her back to him, the cloak across her shoulders, the necklace blazing open at her throat, blazing in the way he now understood was not the fever's illusion and had never been a light like compressed moonlight, like the source of something rather than its reflection. The silver wolves were arranged around her in a loose circle, seated, enormous, their ancient eyes catching the light and holding it. One of them looked at him when he entered. Just looked. He did not move. She turned. It was not a startled turn, not the turn of someone caught unawares. She turned the way people turn when they have known something was coming, and have had time to decide who they intend to be when it arrives, slowly, completely. Her eyes found him across the chamber, and they were silver, not the silver of the necklace, not the silver of the wolves, the silver of something waking up after a long time in the dark, the silver of the moment before a thing becomes what it always was. She looked at him. He had expected fear. He had prepared, without fully acknowledging the preparation, for her fear for the posture of a woman who had been cast out in the snow and knew herself to be at the mercy of the man responsible for it. He knew what to do with fear. He had been navigating it, managing it, wielding it, his entire adult life. She did not give him fear. She did not give him anger, though he would have understood anger, would have found it navigable, would have known what shape to make himself in response. She looked at him with something quieter and more devastating than either of those things. She looked at him with pity. The pity of someone who can see, from where she is standing, something that he cannot yet see from where he is standing, and who understands the distance between those two positions, and who does not hold it against him. The pity of someone who was made small by a large and frightened world and has just remembered that the world was wrong. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. Not because he had not prepared words. He was Alpha. He was always prepared with words, with authority, with the specific cadences of command that had worked on every living thing he had directed them toward for 20 years. He had prepared words on the ride out. Reasonable words. Authoritative words. You will come with me. You will answer questions. You have operated under false pretenses within my territory. Nothing came. Because beneath the words, beneath the authority, beneath every layer of rank and fury and careful grief that he had built himself into over 2 decades, beneath all of it, something older than any of it was doing something he had not given it permission to do. every wolfish instinct he carried, every marrow-deep sense that predated language and rank, and the entire constructed architecture of pack hierarchy. Every ancient thing in him that knew, when it was in the presence of something true, and responded to truth the way compass needles respond to north, involuntary, absolute, incapable of argument. All of it was screaming one word at him. Bow. He did not bow, but he did not speak, either. He stood in the silver light of a woman he had put out in the snow, and she looked at him with her ancient eyes and her pity and her cloak, and the wolves around her did not move, and the moon script breathed against the walls, and the word kept coming, kept rising from somewhere below reason, below pride, below everything he had built. Bow. The silence held them both. Chapter 8. She did not ask to ride. She walked, and the silver wolves walked with her, and Calum rode slightly ahead in the way of a man who needs the small geography of distance to think, and they moved through the snow in a silence that was not comfortable but was, at least, honest. His enforcers flanked wide, giving the silver wolves a berth that was equal parts tactical and instinctive. No one spoke. The trees thinned. The fortress rose. She had walked away from it in the dark, alone, her hands folded around a necklace she only half understood. She returned to it in daylight, flanked by ancient wolves, wearing a cloak that had been waiting in a sealed vault for the specific shape of this moment. She had thought, in the wilderness, about what it would feel like to come back. She had not imagined this. She had not allowed herself imagination. It was a luxury that survival didn't budget for. But if she had imagined, not this. Not the gates opening with the same iron sound they always made, not the cobblestones she had swept 10,000 times receiving her footsteps, not the faces turning toward her from every corner of the courtyard, with expressions that ran the full register of human response to something that rearranges the world. The first sound was silence, the kind that falls when too many people try to speak at once and cancel each other out. Then the chaos found its voice. She heard it in layers, a warrior near the gate, one of the ones who had jeered at the border, his voice pitching upward in something that was trying to be outrage and kept sliding toward fear. Two of the kitchen women clutching each other. A lieutenant, she remembered his name, remembered the way he had looked through her for 2 years as though she were furniture standing very still with an expression of someone doing rapid, private arithmetic, and not liking the results. Some of them had tormented her. Not dramatically. The torment of the low-ranking was rarely dramatic, it was the torment of small erosions. The shoulder that did not move to let her pass. The food left too close to the edge of the table. The comment made just within her hearing, calibrated precisely to the volume of something that could be denied. She had absorbed it, and kept her eyes down, and said nothing, because silence was the price of invisibility, and invisibility was the price of safety. She kept her eyes up now. She did not perform forgiveness. She did not perform anger. She walked across the cobblestones she knew better than she knew her own face, and she let them look, because they had spent 2 years looking through her, and the correction of that error was not her responsibility to make comfortable. The silver wolves moved with her step for step. The crowd pressed back. The envoy arrived as though she had timed it, which, Seraphine suspected, she had. A single horse. A single rider, cloaked entirely in white, ancient in the way that some people become ancient, not diminished by it, but distilled, refined down to the irreducible core of what they always were. She dismounted without assistance, and stood in the center of the courtyard and waited, with the absolute patience of someone who has never needed to raise her voice to fill a room. For the noise to understand it was no longer appropriate. The noise understood. Pack of Blackfang. Her voice was clear and even and carried the specific authority of someone who has been practicing it for longer than most of the people present had been alive. What I am about to tell you is not new. It is old. It is the law your grandparents knew and your parents were too young to remember and you were never taught, because the people who should have taught you were killed before they could. No one moved. 20 years ago, the Luna royal line, the Lunara, was attacked. The Alpha King fell. His court fell. His Luna, a pause, deliberate, did not. She survived long enough to do one thing. She hid what mattered most. The envoy's gaze moved across the courtyard, unhurried, and settled briefly, unmistakably, on Seraphine. She hid her daughter, sealed the child's power inside a vessel she could carry, placed her among people who would not think to look. And the child survived, as the child was meant to. The courtyard had gone the quality of held breath. The necklace was the seal, the envoy continued. It was designed to open under specific conditions, not by choice, not by will, but by nature. By the act of a Luna bloodline expressing itself most fundamentally, she let that land. The preservation of a child. Someone she didn't see who made a sound that was not a word. The woman you banished into the snow, the envoy said, is Seraphine of the Lunara, daughter of the last Luna Queen, heir to a title that does not require your recognition to be true, and does not require an alpha's permission to be claimed. The silence that followed was the silence of a world reorganizing. She heard him before she saw him, the small, quick footsteps she would have recognized anywhere, at any hour, from any depth of sleep. She turned just as Aaron hit the courtyard at a dead run, having escaped whoever had been assigned to keep him from whatever was happening in the yard, his face carrying the uncomplicated urgency of a child who has been separated from something important and has now found it. He ran to her. He grabbed her hand with both of his and held it the way he held it when the night terrors came, and he needed proof that something solid existed in the world. "You came back," he said. "Just that. Just you came back." "I came back," she said. The wave moved through the courtyard like something physical. Half the pack went to their knees. Not in unison, it was not orchestrated, was not the choreographed deference of ceremony. It moved person by person, the way a truth moves when it stops being deniable, when the body concedes what the mind has been arguing against. A warrior near the gate, 3 of the trackers, both kitchen women. The lieutenant who had done his arithmetic and arrived, finally, at the correct answer. Half the pack, kneeling in the snow. The other half turned. They turned to Calum, who had not moved since they'd entered the courtyard, who sat his horse with an expression that Seraphine did not look at directly, because she did not yet have the resources for what she might find there. His pack was watching him. His enforcers were watching him. His son was standing in the snow, holding the hand of a woman he had put outside his walls, and half of everything he commanded was already on its knees, and the other half was waiting to see what their alpha would do. The envoy did not look at him. She did not need to. Seraphine looked at Aaron's hand in hers, at the small bitten nails and the bony knuckles, and felt the necklace warm against her skin, steady and patient, and waited too. The courtyard breathed. Chapter 9. The courtyard waited. This was the thing about power, real power, the kind that had been accumulating across generations, across bloodlines, across the long patience of a truth that had survived massacre and exile, and 20 years of careful forgetting. It did not demand. It did not raise its voice. It simply became undeniable, and the world rearranged itself accordingly, and all that remained was for the people inside that world to decide who they intended to be inside the new shape of it. Half the pack was kneeling. The other half was watching Calum. He had dismounted. She had not seen the moment it happened. She had been looking at Aaron, at his small hand in hers, at the uncomplicated certainty of a child who knows what matters and moves toward it without apology. But when she looked up, Calum was standing on the cobblestones with his horse behind him, and nothing between them but cold air, and the accumulated weight of everything that had happened, and everything that hadn't. He was looking at her. She had seen his face in many configurations, over 2 years of careful invisibility. She had catalogued them the way the cautious catalog, the moods of the powerful, not out of admiration, but out of self-preservation. She had seen his authority, which sat on him like architecture. She had seen his grief, which he wore turned inward, hidden, the grief of a man who has decided that feeling it privately is the only dignified option. She had seen his fury in the training yard, cold and surgical, the fury that had pointed at her and made her an exile. She had not seen this. He looked like a man who had been handed a mirror in a room he thought he knew, and found it showed him a room he didn't recognize. He looked like a man doing the accounting of himself, and arriving at a number he had not expected and could not dispute. He looked, beneath the alpha and the power and the careful architecture of control, like something more difficult than any of those things. He looked like a man who understood what he had done. The courtyard was very quiet. The snow had stopped. The silver wolves had arranged themselves at the perimeter with the patience of things that have been waiting for this specific moment for longer than anyone present could account for. The envoy in white stood to the side and watched and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said, because this was not her moment, and she knew it. Arin's hand tightened in Seraphine's. Calum opened his mouth. She watched him search for something, a speech, an argument, the particular arrangement of words that authority reaches for when it needs to manage a situation. She watched him find nothing. She watched the search end. What replaced it was worse, and better, and more real than anything a speech could have been. He moved without ceremony. One knee first, the way of a man for whom kneeling is not instinctive and does not come with muscle memory, careful, deliberate, each degree of descent, a separate decision made against the accumulated resistance of a lifetime of not bowing to anything. Then the other knee. The alpha of the Black Fang pack, the most feared wolf clan in the Northern Territories, kneeling in the snow of his own courtyard before the woman he had put outside his walls. The weight of it was visible. That was what she had not expected, that she would be able to see it, the actual weight of his mistakes pressing down through his shoulders, through the set of his jaw, through the way his hands rested on his knees with none of their usual authority. He carried it openly, which was perhaps the only generous thing he had ever done without knowing it was generous. The sound that moved through the courtyard was the sound of the remaining half of the pack finding their knees. One by one, then in clusters, then all at once, warriors and trackers and lieutenants and kitchen staff, the ones who had tormented her with small erosions and the ones who had simply looked away, the ones who had carried out the banishment, and the ones who had watched it and done nothing. The snow received them all without distinction. The courtyard filled with the sound of it, not silence, but its cousin, the specific acoustic of a large number of people making themselves small in the presence of something they had collectively failed to recognize. Calum looked up at her. His eyes, this close, without the fury in them, were the dark gray of winter sky before snow decides to fall. She had not known the color of his eyes. She had never been permitted the proximity to find out. He said, "I didn't know." 3 words. No architecture of justification built around them. No subordinate clause offering context or mitigation. Just the 3 words, offered plainly, in the voice of a man who has decided that plainness is the only thing he has left that is worth offering. "I didn't know," which was true. She understood that it was true. She had spent enough time in the wilderness with nothing but silence and honesty for company to understand the difference between the cruelty of intent and the cruelty of blindness. And what Calum had done to her had been the second kind, which did not make the snow less cold or the exile less real, but which meant something, regardless, about what came next. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman whose voice she had finally recovered from the dream, her mother, pressing something into her hands, saying a word she now knew. She thought about what that woman had built and lost, and what she had chosen to do with the time she had between the loss and the end. She thought about the chapel vault, the cradle, the cloak folded with such deliberate care by hands that understood they were folding it for someone who would need it. She thought about what true Lunas do. They do not destroy broken things. She reached out. Her hand found his upturned, cold from the snow. The hand of a man who had not known what to do with a situation he had never been taught to face, and she took it. Not in absolution. Not in the erasure of what had been done. The wound was real, and it would stay real, and that was the only honest arrangement she had to offer. She was not her mother, restored to a world that had burned. She was herself, standing in the wreckage of something, deciding what to build. She took his hand in the way of someone who has chosen the harder thing deliberately, who understands that restoration is not the same as forgetting, who has looked at broken and decided that broken is still worth the effort. His hand closed around hers. Arin, between them, let out a breath that sounded like a child releasing something he'd been holding for a very long time. The silver wolves, at the perimeter, settled. The courtyard held them all, the kneeling and the risen, the guilty and the witness, the pack that had forgotten its own laws, and the woman who had survived the forgetting, and the snow was still, and the sky was clearing, and the necklace against Seraphine's sternum was warm and steady, and finally quiet. Not sealed, not hidden. Home. Chapter 10. They dressed her in the old colors. Deep blue, the blue of sky at the precise moment before it becomes night. She recognized it from the vault, from the cradle lining gone soft with age, from the fabric that had waited in the dark for this specific morning. Someone had found cloth to match it, which meant someone had gone to considerable effort, which meant that the world had been moving in directions she hadn't tracked while she was occupied with surviving it. The cloak from the vault was cleaned and mended and settled across her shoulders, the Lunara sigil resting between her shoulder blades like a hand placed there in encouragement. The necklace she wore openly. She had not tucked it beneath a collar since the chapel. She did not intend to again. The ceremony was held in the courtyard. This had been the envoy's decision, and it was the right one, not the great hall, not some interior chamber sealed away from the cold in the sky. Outside, where the pack could stand in the same air as the thing that was happening, where the sky could witness, where the moon script could be carved temporarily into the snow itself and mean something. The council had their traditions, and Seraphine had not argued with any of them, because they were, she was discovering, mostly right the bones of them, the architecture of intention beneath the ceremony. The Lunara had built these rituals the way the chapel vault had been built, to last, to carry weight across the generations that needed carrying. She stood at the courtyard center while the pack assembled. She watched them come in, the warriors who had looked through her, the kitchen staff who had known her best and shown it least, the lieutenants whose hierarchy she had understood from the bottom, the trackers, the healers, the young wolves who had grown up in the Black Fang tradition of ranked brutality and absorbed it the way children absorb everything completely, without the equipment yet to question it. They came in and they stood, and none of them looked through her now. She felt the difference in her body before she fully processed it with her mind. 2 years of making herself forgettable, of calibrating her every movement to produce the minimum of notice, and now the weight of their attention. All of it, landing openly, and her own stillness in the face of it. She did not shrink. She had not been able to shrink since the chapel, since the shift, since the name carved in moonscript had restored to her the knowledge of who she was shrinking from. She stood in the cold and received their looking, and was undiminished by it. The reckoning had come first, the day before, and she had been present for all of it. Not execution, she had been clear on this, and the envoy had agreed, and Calum had not objected. The Lunara tradition was not punitive in the way that fear-based power was punitive. It was accountable. There was a difference, and the difference mattered, because the goal was not pain, but change, the kind of change that required people to stand in clear light and see themselves accurately and live with what they saw. The ones who had tormented her stood before the pack and accounted for what they had done. Some were reassigned, some were demoted. Some simply had to speak their actions aloud in front of everyone who had witnessed them, which was, for certain personalities, the hardest consequence of all. She watched their faces as they did. It watched some of them arrive, across the course of speaking, at something that looked genuinely like shame, which was the beginning of the only thing that made shame useful. She did not perform mercy. She also did not perform hardness. She was simply there, and witnessed, and when it was over, she returned to her chambers, and sat quietly for a while with her hands in her lap, and let it settle. Aaron found his place at the front before anyone had to direct him there. She had made it in the wilderness, during the second week, when the silver wolves were circling, and the dreams were harrowing, and she had needed something to do with her hands that was not about survival. A small disc of wood, smooth-grained, carved with a moon sigil she had reproduced from memory, from the carvings, from the vault, from the deep marrow knowledge that had been working its way back to the surface. She'd worn a cord through it and left it in his chambers the morning of her return, and he had put it on immediately and had not removed it since. He wore it now. He sat front and center and watched her with the uncomplicated pride of someone who has never doubted her, which was its own form of grace to be known by a person who knew you before you knew yourself, and to have that person remain unsurprised by what you turned out to be. She held his gaze for a moment and looked away before either of them said anything with their faces that would make it difficult to continue. Calum stood to her left. Not ahead, not behind. Beside, and she understood this had been a choice he had made deliberately, in the way he made most things now, with the careful intentionality of a man who has discovered that his instincts required supervision. He had not spoken much since the courtyard. He was not, she was learning, a man of many words in the presence of things that outpaced his vocabulary. He communicated instead through action, through presence, through the consistent and unremarked fact of showing up and standing where he was supposed to stand. He was learning. She was learning him learning. It was imperfect in the way that real things are imperfect, and she found she could work with it, which was not the same as trust but was, perhaps, its honest precursor. He stood beside her and faced forward and said nothing. The envoy spoke the old words. Seraphine had been given them to read the night before, the Lunara coronation rite in its ancient form, and she had sat with them for a long time, not memorizing, just absorbing, letting the weight of what they carried settle through her. The way the chapel had settled, the way the shift had settled, the way her name carved in stone had settled, layer by layer, truth arriving in the body before the mind was ready. When the envoy finished and fell silent, the necklace blazed. She felt it happen before she saw it, the warmth becoming light, the light expanding, not the cautious silver glow of the vault, but something larger, more committed. The radiance of something that has been held back long enough and has decided that enough is enough. It blazed across the snow, illuminated the carved moon script at the courtyard's perimeter, threw the faces of the assembled pack into sharp and merciful clarity. From the forest edge, the silver wolves began to howl. One voice first, the scarred one. She knew it by texture and then the others joining. The sound building into something that was not mournful and not triumphant, but somewhere older than either of those words. A sound that the wilderness made when it was witnessing something it had been waiting to witness. The pack, without instruction, added their voices. The sound went up into the cold, clear sky, and she let it wash over her and thought of her mother, who had pressed a necklace into a child's hands and chosen the only form of hope available to her, which was the long and unglamorous hope of survive until it matters. She thought about the vault, the cradle, the cloak folded with hands that were afraid, and folded it anyway. She looked out at the pack. Hers, by birthright. Hers, by something harder than birthright, by the survival of it, by the wilderness, by the choosing to return, by the hand extended in a courtyard to a man who didn't deserve it yet, and might grow into deserving, given time. She waited for triumph. It didn't come. What came instead was quieter, deeper. The feeling of a door that had been sealed for 20 years opening fully, and the air inside finally matching the air outside, and the difference between the two ceasing to be a wound. Home, the moon had always known. She had simply needed to arrive at the moment the moon had already seen, and the moon, as it turned out, had not been late. The moon had been exactly on time. This story is about more than werewolves and pack politics. At its heart, it carries a message that cuts across every world, real or imagined. Your worth was never determined by the people who failed to see it. Seraphine was always the Luna in the cold, on her knees, invisible, banished. The truth didn't change because no one recognized it. It waited, and it arrived. This story is for everyone who has ever been dismissed, underestimated, or cast out by people who should have known better. Your moment is coming, and when it does, it will be undeniable. If this story moved you, subscribe and hit the bell. You don't want to miss what comes next.